Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 29 of the American Pageant titled Wilsonian Progressivism in Peace and War from 1913 to 1920. As always, we're going to be using the 16th edition of the American Pageant. If you have an earlier or later edition or a completely different textbook, don't worry about it, the content's going to be the same. So to start off, let's talk about key concepts, or rather lack thereof. Obviously, I'm not going to be putting in key concepts anymore because I'm pretty sure it's copyrighted material and I don't want to get in trouble for that, so I'm just going to avoid it. But if you do want to reference your key concepts, which I highly recommend you do, you can refer to the start of the chapter in the textbook, and it should probably be there. At least that's where it is in the American Pageant. So if you want to reference your key concepts, you definitely should, because it will first of all help you organize your information, and it's sort of like built-in studying for the AP exam, because when you categorize information according to the key concepts, it sort of helps you recall it easily for LEQs and other open response questions. So highly recommend you do that. So to start off, let's talk about Wilsonian progressivism. Specifically, what exactly is it and what exactly does Wilson do that makes him a more progressive president? And by the end of the chapter, one of your takeaways should be that Wilson accomplished many progressive reforms as president, but ultimately these were cut short due to the ensuing World War, and it ultimately inspired a new era of progressivism. And during this time, we were going to see a renewed belief in Jeffersonian democracy, where the informed masses make important decisions. The idea that the power belongs to the people and that people are educated enough and responsible enough to make the best decisions for the country. And this sort of belief system sort of appreciated, I guess, Confederates for attempting to uphold their independence and standing up for what they believe in, but more importantly, it inspired Wilson to uphold the ideal of self-determination in other countries. The idea that countries are fully capable of caring for themselves, and if they need help, they will call the necessary countries and they will ask for help. So in other words, the US shouldn't push themselves onto other countries just because they want to and to fulfill their ulterior motives, but only help when help is necessary. And we'll talk more about his foreign policy later, but this is definitely a key idea that you should know about. And Wilson also wanted to attack what he called the triple wall of privilege, which included high tariffs, banks, and trusts. And these were essentially the three components that he believed allowed big business to thrive and ultimately exploit other people, but really just thrive without any competition. Because high tariffs, they eliminated foreign competition. The banks financed all of big business ventures and their, just expenses. And then trusts were corrupt ways of, again, financing businesses and just ensuring that they have power in an industry and like a monopoly in an industry. So he really wanted to attack this and ensure that people who, or rather businesses that became famous and grew to greater heights, earned that right because they made a superior product. And the first way Wilson decides to do this is through the tariff, specifically the Underwood Tariff of 1913. This was the biggest tariff reduction in 50 years, and farmers and lower classes are super happy with the lowered import fees and the graduated income tax. So now big industries aren't protected from the tariff, and they have foreign competition. They have to actually produce good products because people aren't limited to the domestic market anymore. And they also have to pay more money with taxes because they make more money. So obviously more money, more problems, oldie but a goodie. And this is really just one way that Wilson does this. And another way that Wilson attacks this problem is through reforming the banks, specifically with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. So Wilson wanted a decentralized bank that was controlled by the government, not a private one. And this act specifically regulated banking, increased the circulation of paper money, and later helped with the financial crises during World War I. So definitely an important act to know about. And last but not least, Wilson attacked the trusts, and he does this mostly through antitrust legislation, but also through things like the Federal Trade Commission of 1914. This commission was in charge of crushing monopolies, especially in interstate commerce industries like the railroad. And they did this by eliminating false advertising, mislabeling, bribery, and other unfair trading practices. But aside from this commission, Wilson also utilized antitrust legislation, specifically the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. And this act said that labor unions were no longer controlled by anti-monopoly restraints, as they had been with the Sherman Antitrust Act. So if you remember, that act, it aimed to do the same thing as this one. It wanted to get rid of monopolies, trusts, anything that would allow big business to exploit people and the industry and in general profit more than they should be capable of. But really, the way it was worded actually went against labor unions and hurt them a lot. So, for example, it said something like, your practices can't inhibit trade or stop trade. And so this was used against labor unions when they went on strike, because technically when they were going on strike, they weren't working, and so they were inhibiting trade, and this was used to prosecute them for striking. And overall, the Clayton Antitrust Act increased the number of things that were deemed questionable business practices. So, for example, interlocking directorates, which you can look more into in the textbook. It's not really that important for our purposes here, but that's one example. And although this is definitely a very, very good thing, like Wilson is sort of protecting labor unions now, they aren't as easily prosecuted as they had been before, labor is still going to face many difficulties, as we'll see in the future. But Wilson did do other things for the labor movement. And yes, I know the slide does say foreign policy. We're going to get to that in a minute, but I didn't have space on the other side, so I'm just going to put it here. Relating to Wilsonian progressivism and specifically the labor movement, you should know about the Working Men's Compensation Act of 1916, which helped federal employees during periods of disability and set a precedent for workers' compensation during the New Deal. You should also know about the Adamson Act, also of 1916, which established a maximum 8-hour workday for workers on trains in interstate commerce and with more pay for overtime work. So definitely two you should know about. But moving on, let's talk about Wilson's foreign policy. And really all you need to know is that he disliked imperialism, big stick diplomacy, and dollar diplomacy. And you really see this with the Jones Act of 1916. So this granted the Philippines territorial status and promised eventual independence once a stable government was established. And they eventually did get this freedom in 1946. But he's essentially telling the Philippines, wait, we'll get it. You will get your independence, which is definitely an improvement from previous presidents who were very hesitant to give the Philippines this independence because they thought that it wouldn't serve their ulterior motives and that, you know, all of their fighting for the Philippines and other territories that were acquired during that war would, you know, be in vain. So Wilson is definitely showing that he appreciates self-determination of other countries, and he demonstrates this pretty clearly with the Philippines. He's showing that he respects their boundaries and their rights as a country. However, Wilson was not completely innocent. He will be an imperialist when it's necessary to protect American interests abroad, and you really see this with his response to the Haitian Revolution and the purchase of the Virgin Islands in Denmark. Again, the specifics of that in particular aren't super important, but really what you should know is that Wilson is going to be imperialist when it serves national interests, so definitely keep that in mind. And one really important international event that occurs during Wilson's presidency is the Mexican Revolution of 1913. And this led many Mexicans to migrate to America and also led to domestic calls to intervene in Mexico to protect American lives and property because this was a very tumultuous time. Mexican Revolution could possibly threaten American property, could lead to the destruction of property, and people were scared that they were going to lose these big investments. And so Wilson's really aggressive foreign ambassador imposed an arms embargo and funded the revolutionary government's opposition. They did not want this revolution to happen because it would likely mean destruction of property, specifically American property, and in general would be a tumultuous experience. And this all leads to the Tampico incident of 1914. So some Mexicans accidentally arrested American sailors and later apologized to them, but Wilson ordered the Navy to seize the Mexican port of Veracruz. And ultimately, war was avoided through mediation with South American powers, but when this new rebel government came to power in Mexico after, following the revolution, the U.S. fought them for some time, but soon withdrew because World War I was looming closer. They realized that it was not worth their time or energy to spend so much money on such a relatively smaller conflict when they had these bigger problems, especially with European countries looming ahead of them, and they wanted to prepare for that instead. Speaking of which, let's talk about World War I, specifically how it starts, what happens, everyone involved, all of that. And it really starts when the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary is murdered by a Serbian patriot, and this causes a chain reaction of conflict within Europe. And it really comes down to two groups you should know about: the Central Powers, which included Austria-Hungary, Germany, and later Bulgaria and Turkey, and the Allies, which included France, Britain, Russia, Japan, and Italy. But from early on in the war, Wilson issues a neutrality proclamation. He doesn't want to get involved in the war because he knows it's going to drain their finances, their resources, it will take a lot of time, and he really just wants to focus on the nation and bettering people's lives. But ultimately, the close economic and cultural ties between the US and Britain lead to domestic sympathy for the Allied cause. Simultaneously, you also see an increase in anti-German sentiment when leaked documents show plans for industrial sabotage. But regardless, Americans still want to stay out of the war. Nothing has happened yet that makes them really push for war, and they don't really have any motives in any of those countries either, aside from, some ties with Britain, but they really don't have any need to go to war either. Meanwhile, Britain harassed American shipping to prevent them from helping the Germans, but pledged to avoid neutral shipping. But the war really starts to heat up when U-boats get involved, and this was essentially German submarine warfare that sank 90 ships in the war zone. In fact, they unintentionally get the US involved with the sinking of a passenger ship known as the Lusitania in 1915. Over 1,000 lives were lost, 128 of which were American. So this is definitely one point that's sort of pushing America closer towards getting involved in World War I. But remember, Wilson was being pacifist and he was also somewhat isolationist, so he pursued diplomatic means with some success. And Germany issues a Sussex Pledge saying that they would give warning before sinking passenger or merchant ships, but this was eventually broken. On a side note, Wilson is re-elected in 1916. Again, not super important for the time being, but something you should be cognizant of. And one really important thing that happens following the election is the publication of the Zimmermann Note in 1917. And this was intercepted from German Foreign Secretary George Zimmermann, and it proposed a German-Mexican alliance with promises of Mexico getting back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. So this is a direct threat to the US and their property, and this is really what gets them into the war. I mean, they have no choice at this point. There has been a direct threat made on the land, and they want to protect it. So Wilson is reluctant to go to war, but he decides that since it's in the best interest of the country and protecting the country in general, he has to go to war. So let's talk about that. What exactly happens during World War I? For one, you should note that Wilson will try to garner support for the war by making it about spreading democracy to the entire world. So the idea of not fighting for territorial gains, but rather the noble idea of democracy, is really what's going to drive this the US's entry into the war, among other things, of course, like the Zimmermann Note and the Lusitania and all those other events. But really the idea that we are doing this service to the international community by spreading democracy and hopefully ensuring like a peaceful international community, that's really what he's trying to persuade people that he's trying to do. And obviously this isn't completely true, but it really does help him garner support for the war effort. Wilson also writes a document known as the 14 Points in 1918. So this was essentially to ensure peace following World War I, and it said things like no secret treaties, free seas, less economic barriers between nations, adjustment of colonial claims to appease anti-imperialists, and encourage eventual self-determination, as they wanted to do with the Philippines. They wanted to sort of encourage that on an international scale. And the other allies kind of shied away from this. They're like, yeah, no, we're just not going to do that, because it was a lot to ask, but they didn't really take it seriously. So although it was a noble goal, no one really took it for anything beyond words on a page. And to further garner support for the war, the Committee of Public Information is created by a journalist named George Creel, and it created pro-war propaganda based largely on anti-German sentiment. So people expect a lot out of the war, but will later feel disillusioned when not everything they'd hoped to accomplish happens, and we'll talk more about this later. Another thing you should know about is the Espionage Act of 1917. So this banned interference with the draft and other acts of quote-unquote disloyalty to the nation, including penalties for criticizing the government in writing. And it really shows how civil liberties are reduced in wartime. I mean, this is a basic First Amendment right, but during the war, everyone needs to be on board. Otherwise, there's going to be strikes, protests. It's going to cost more money to suppress those rebellions. And ultimately, the government just wants to end the war with little financial expense, or at least as little as possible, so that the nation doesn't go into debt. And they see this sort of opposition to the war as dangerous because they think it's going to cost more money and just extend the war and cause like domestic chaos. So they're going to limit these civil liberties during wartime, as we'll see in future wars as well. And the morality of this is really tested with the Supreme Court case Schenck versus United States in 1919. So essentially, this man was arrested for handing out leaflets encouraging individuals to resist the draft, claiming freedom of speech, First Amendment rights. But the Supreme Court ruled that if freedom of speech is presenting a clear and present danger to others, it can be limited. So in other words, they're saying we're in a war right now. We don't want people to say things that oppose the government's rhetoric because it will cause more disruption than we already have in the world, and we need to like unite under a common cause. So ultimately they decide that yes, civil liberties can be limited during wartime. Aside from that, you should know about the War Industries Board. This was a board that coordinated industrial production during the war by creating production quotas and collecting raw materials to increase efficiency. So overall, it led to a massive increase in industrial production domestically, and it just in general aided the war effort. And keep in mind that there's a strong anti-German sentiment during this time, as well as rationing behavior to save resources for the war, and this all really leads to greater anti-alcohol beliefs, and all of this eventually leads to the 18th Amendment, which led to prohibition, or in other words, nationwide prohibition of alcohol, which we'll get to more in a bit, but it definitely starts really at this point. But really, you should note that there are a lot of domestic concerns during the war. For example, unemployed men would be eligible for the draft, so there's no time for labor to demand reforms because really, if they're unemployed, men have no choice but to go to war in order to make money for their family back home. So now labor unions can't demand that they have better work hours or better like working conditions, better pay, because the nation is in a crisis state. So they can't really do any of that, and the labor movement is sort of halted at the moment. And so, in an effort to demand reform, the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as the IWW, is created during this time. And this was essentially a radical anti-war labor union that organized thousands of labor protests during the war, which greatly affected industrial production to bring attention to poor working conditions. And so labor unrest continued to happen throughout the war, which further, directed resources towards suppressing them and further directed attention away from the war effort. Aside from this, you should know about the Great Migration, where African American workers went to the North to escape the lingering racial tensions in the South and find better industrial opportunities, which were plentiful due to the war. So keep in mind, the Civil War technically hasn't been that long before. Jim Crow laws are still there, and it's really taken a toll on African American workers. They're constantly discriminated against, constantly harassed. Racism is still prevalent in the South. So really, they want to go to the North to escape these racial tensions, but also to find a lot of work in the industries because they know that the North is sort of like an industrial hub, and they know that industries are freaking out right now because they're in panic mode. They're trying to produce as much resources as possible for the war effort, so they're going to go to the North because they know that they're going to find plenty of job opportunities there. And soon after the war ends, the 19th Amendment is passed in 1920, which gave women the right to vote after the government saw how much women worked in factories during the war. They saw that they were actually, providing to the community in ways besides their homemaking capabilities, and that they should be given the rights that they've deserved for a long time. And this is really great because it's like, finally, this is happening. But it's also kind of sad because, a lot of women were anti-war. They didn't want this war to happen. But a lot of suffragists argued that helping during the war effort would allow women to shape the peace post-war. So by not going against the government rhetoric, maybe they could get what they want in the end. And it really raised this question of, does the end justify the means? Does killing people in war, does supporting that sort of justify the means or justify the ends that we are going to get rights to vote? So that was definitely a debate that was happening during that time as well. And shortly after the passage of this amendment, we have the passage of the Shepherd-Towner Maternity Act in 1921. This provided for federally financed maternal and infant care, and it shows that despite the recent major accomplishment for the feminist movement, traditional norms for women are still ingrained in society. So, women are expected to be homemakers, and although many women did actually leave their factory jobs following the war and go back to their homemaking responsibilities, a lot of women also stayed in working in jobs. So clearly, there is this sort of societal norms aspect that they still have to overcome. And lastly, sort of unrelated to domestic concerns, but something you should definitely know about is the American Expeditionary Forces, also known as the AEF. This was a U.S. Army force which was deployed to Europe consisting mostly of drafted soldiers. And by the time the Army was sufficiently prepared, the war was mostly over. So, it's not like it made a huge impact in the war, but it was definitely there, so it might be something you want to know about. And finally, before we talk about the end of World War I, let's talk a little bit about the battles. They're not super important because you're not going to be directly tested on them, at least not on the AP exam, but it's definitely good to have as outside knowledge if you want to bring that into an LEQ or DBQ or whatever. So, it won't hurt to know it, but you definitely don't need to have it ingrained in your memory or anything. So first off, you have the Battle of Chateau-Thierry in 1918. This was the first significant use of the American Army during the war, and the French were really thankful for the extra support that the troops provided. Again, not really much you need to know beyond that, but yeah. Next one you should know about is the Second Battle of Marne, which halted German expansion with a successful counteroffensive. And this really marked the beginning of the end for the Germans. So this is definitely a good one to know about. And last battle you need to know about for World War I is the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And for context, the US had demanded to do more beyond just aiding the French and British armies, so they were put in charge of this offensive to cut German railroad lines. And despite some fatalities, it was somewhat successful and the Germans were defeated. And just a side note, it wasn't really the military strategy that Americans pursued, it was really just the sheer amount of them present. So yeah, that's really all you need to know in terms of battles. Again, it's just outside information. You don't need to have these ingrained in your head, but it might be helpful if you do. But one thing you should definitely know about is the League of Nations, and this was again Wilson's idea to create an international council where world powers could consult on various issues to ensure world peace and prevent another war. And although some other countries did agree with the idea, many Americans didn't want to get involved in foreign affairs again, so Wilson eventually pulls out of the League of Nations, and people are like, well, this was your idea, so why did you propose it if you weren't going to do it in the first place? And really, it's because of the domestic sort of isolationist sentiment that's going to surround the post-war era, because everyone's disillusioned. They really feel like they didn't accomplish what they wanted to in the war, and they don't want to be involved in any sort of foreign events and anything that involves other countries, so they're going to opt out of the League of Nations. In fact, when Wilson runs for re-election in 1920, people vote for Warren Harding instead because they know he'll dismantle the League. And so eventually the League fails and America becomes really isolationist post-World War I. This is definitely something you need to know about in terms of foreign policy before, during, and after the war, and specifically also World War II. Definitely some concepts you should know about because they're probably going to end up on a DBQ, LEQ, or multiple choice. And finally, last thing you should know about from this chapter is the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. This was signed in France, and it essentially established terms of settlement between Germany and the Allied powers, and essentially blamed the entire war on Germany to justify German disarmament and exacting heavy reparation tolls. They're basically like, why are you the way that you are? You suck. And this is going to obviously lead to consequences in the future, but really, all you should know about now is that France thought it wasn't enough to prevent future aggression, Germany obviously thought it was too much, it was too harsh, and the US didn't want to be involved, so they kind of just let it run its course. And yeah, that does it for this chapter. Here are the credits for how I got everything you just saw. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below if you have any questions. Please be sure to like, subscribe, all of that, you know the drill. And yeah, see you in the next video.